The morning started wrong. I knew it the way you know weather. Not from data, not from forecast, but from the particular quality of silence in the guardroom at 0437 when Sergeant Hargreaves set down his tea without drinking it. Hargreaves never set down tea without drinking it. The man consumed Earl Grey the way the Thames consumed rain, constantly, indiscriminately, without apparent pleasure. He set down the cup. Right then. Something in me recalibrated. A small internal dial, the one they install somewhere between your third week of cataract and your first live posting, ticked from routine to aware. Not alarmed, not yet, just the animal part of the brain lifting its nose. "Briefing's moved up," Hargreaves said. "Main hall, full detail." He didn't look at me when he said it. That was the second wrong thing. Hargreaves always looked at you. He was one of those NCOs who'd learned that eye contact was a weapon more reliable than anything the Army issued, and he deployed it with the casual precision of a man who'd been making junior soldiers wish they'd never been born since before most of us had started shaving. But now his gaze was fixed somewhere middle distance, aimed at a spot on the wall where the plaster had cracked in a shape that, if you squinted during a long night shift, looked vaguely like the outline of Kent. I pulled on my tunic. The fabric resisted at the shoulders. It always did in cold weather, the wool contracting overnight into something that felt less like a uniform and more like a reprimand. I'd been with the Household Division for 7 years, the last 14 months on the Prince of Wales's protection detail. And every single morning I still had to fight my own tunic. They don't tell you that in the recruitment videos. Be the best. Sure. But first, wrestle your clothes. The hallway from the guardroom to the main briefing hall runs beneath Buckingham Palace like a vein. Low ceilings. That particular shade of cream paint that every government building in Britain shares, the color of institutional reluctance. Our boots echoed in patterns, 9 men walking in near unison, the slight drag of Collins's left heel, where his prosthetic didn't quite match his stride, the sharper clip of Lieutenant Asante's pace at the front, her steps always 2 beats faster than necessary, as though she were perpetually arriving at a meeting she was already late for. I fell in beside Corporal Danny Whelan, and who was doing the thing he always did before briefings he suspected would be bad, counting the ceiling tiles. His lips moved silently, the numbers a rosary. "How many?" I asked. 37 to the first turn. 42 on Tuesdays." "It's the same hallway every day, Danny." "Tuesdays the light's different, changes the shadow on the junction tiles. Could be 38. This was Danny. He cataloged the world the way other people breathe, not because he chose to, but because stopping would mean engaging with the thing underneath. We all had a version of it. Mine was the notebook. Black, pocket-sized, waterproof cover. I wrote everything down. Times, positions, the exact angle of a door left ajar. Not because procedure required it. My logs went well beyond requirement. Into a territory my commanding officer once described as forensically unnecessary. I wrote because the writing kept the thinking in order, and the thinking in order kept the feeling at bay, and the feeling at bay kept me standing. 7 years. The system worked. We filed into the main hall, and I knew it was worse than I'd calculated. Colonel Ainsley was there, which was expected for a full detail briefing. But behind Ainsley, standing with that particular quality of stillness that meant she was furious, was Dame Vivian Cross, Deputy Director of Royal Protection, SO14, the Metropolitan Police's contribution to keeping the monarchy vertical and breathing. Dame Vivian did not attend routine briefings. Dame Vivian attended situations. I opened my notebook, clicked the pen. "Gentlemen," Ainsley said. He paused. A remembered Lieutenant Asante existed, and added, "And Lieutenant." Asante's jaw did something complicated. She let it pass. At 22:47 last night, a credible threat was received targeting the Wales family residence at Kensington Palace. Ainsley's voice was the same steady baritone he used for everything from breakfast orders to bomb threats, the vocal equivalent of beige. The threat was assessed by JTAC as severe, with specific reference to the children. My pen stopped. The children. I wrote the words. I watched my hand write them. The letters came out slightly too large, the pressure of the pen too heavy, carving into the page beneath. The principal, Ainsley continued. Principal being the bloodless operational term for Prince William, as though the future King of England were an item on an insurance form, has been briefed, and he has requested that the planned schedule for today proceed without visible alteration. The public-facing events, the school visit at Thomas's Battersea, the reception at the Geographical Society, will go ahead. What changes is everything beneath it. Dame Vivian stepped forward. She was a small woman, built like a compressed spring, and she wore her authority the way some people wear perfume. You couldn't see it, but it preceded her into every room. We're doubling the inner cordon, she said. Armed response on 3-minute standby instead of 5. Plainclothes units at every perimeter gate. I want 2 shadows on each child at all times. 1 visible, 1 not. The school has been quietly informed. Their head teacher is former military intelligence and has been cooperative without being told why. A pause. Which is how we like them. She looked at each of us in sequence. When her gaze reached me, it stopped. Sergeant Ellis, you're on Prince George today. Something in my chest did a small, involuntary rearrangement. Prince George, 11 years old, 3rd in line to the throne of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and a boy who, last Thursday, had asked me if I'd ever seen a cloud shaped like a Labrador, and I'd said no, and he'd seemed genuinely disappointed, and I'd spent the rest of that shift angry at the sky for not cooperating. Yes, ma'am. Close protection. You'll be with him from the school gates to hand over at Kensington. Lieutenant Asante has operational command. Do not deviate from her positioning unless you are physically unable to comply. Clear? Crystal, nah, ma'am. She held my gaze for 1 beat longer than necessary. I understood what the extra beat meant. It meant, this child does not get so much as a grazed knee on your watch, or I will personally reconstruct you into a cautionary PowerPoint slide for the next intake. The briefing continued. Threat profile, suspect description, communication protocols. I wrote it all down. Every word, my pen moving with the desperate industry of a man who knows that the moment he stops writing, he'll start thinking about what happens if he fails, and what an 11-year-old's face looks like when he's afraid, and what that specific fear would do to the boy's father, who has already lost more than most people ever hold. I didn't think about that. I wrote about radio frequencies instead. The armored Jaguar collected me from the Wellington Barracks side gate at 06:15. I sat in the back with my kit, Glock 17 in the underarm holster, the weight of it a familiar pressure against my ribs like a second heartbeat, earpiece already feeding me the low murmur of the communications net, spare magazine in the left trouser pocket where most people keep their phone, and in the right trouser pocket where most people keep their keys, a small blue inhaler that did not belong to me. The inhaler was George's. He'd left it in the detail car 3 weeks ago after an autumn cold that had lingered in his chest, and I'd meant to return it through the proper channels, which involved handing it to the household administrator who would log it and pass it to the nanny who would place it back in his school bag. But the proper channels felt somehow wrong for a thing this small, this personal, this shaped by a child's mouth. So I'd kept it in my pocket. A talisman I didn't believe in and couldn't let go of. My notebook records the drive as 12 minutes. The traffic on Kensington Road was light, the early hour emptying London to that skeletal version of itself that only shift workers and insomniacs recognize, a city of closed shutters and foxes and the particular melancholy of a red bus with no passengers. The driver, a Metropolitan Police civilian named Raj, didn't speak. Raj never spoke. In 6 months of shared drives, and I had heard him say exactly 4 things. Morning, cheers, roadworks on the A4, and once, memorably, during a near miss with a cyclist. Oh, for heaven's sake. He was, in my estimation, the perfect colleague. We reached Kensington Palace at 6:31. The outer perimeter was already populated. I clocked 3 unmarked vehicles I recognized as SO-14, 2 I didn't. The gates were staffed by household cavalry troopers who managed to look both ceremonial and lethal, a trick that requires years of practice and a certain contempt for comfort that the British military cultivates like other nations cultivate wine. I stepped out. The cold hit. November in London is not dramatic cold, not the kind that announces itself. It's the kind that seeps, through tunic, through skin, yet through the professional detachment you've built between yourself and the small blue inhaler in your pocket. Lieutenant Asante was already at the inner gate, tablet in hand, earpiece in, looking like she'd been awake for hours. She probably had. Asante operated on a sleep schedule that I suspected was purely theoretical. Ellis. Good. Walk with me. We moved through the grounds. I noted positions. 2 uniforms at the East Garden, 1 plainclothes by the Orangery. I recognized D.C. Moran by the way he stood, weight on his back foot, left hand always near his hip, the posture of a man who'd drawn his weapon in a real situation and never fully holstered the memory. Update from overnight, Asante said, her voice low. Second communication intercepted at 0312. Same source, more specific this time. How specific? She stopped walking. He turned to me. Asante had a face that did not trade in ambiguity. When she was concerned, the concern was architectural, visible in the set of her jaw, the slight narrowing of her eyes, the way her hand gripped the tablet like she was considering using it as a weapon. They named the school, Ellis. The ground shifted, not literally. But something in the way my boots connected with the gravel changed, became more deliberate, more conscious, as though the earth beneath the palace had quietly informed my body that casualness was no longer permitted. Right. I checked my Glock, drew it, dropped the magazine, checked the rounds, reseated it. The motion was mechanical, unnecessary. I'd checked it 20 minutes ago. But my hands needed occupation the way Danny needed ceiling tiles. Does the principal know? He knows. He's... She paused. I chose her next word with the precision of someone diffusing ordnance. Contained. Contained. I understood the word's full weight. It meant William was holding it together. It meant the holding was visible. It meant that behind whatever composed face the Prince of Wales was presenting to his household staff this morning, there was a father who'd been told someone had named his son's school in a threat, and the distance between composed and contained was the distance between calm water and water that was very, very still, because something enormous was moving beneath it. I didn't write that in my notebook. Some observations are too heavy for paper. The school run, which sounds mundane, which sounds like something involving packed lunches and forgotten permission slips, which sounds like the most ordinary act a parent performs, was, and that morning, an operation with 17 moving parts, 4 armed vehicles, 2 helicopter assets on standby, and a man in the back seat of an armored Range Rover who was trying very hard to talk to his son about football. I was in the follow car, 30 meters behind, watching through the windshield as the Range Rover moved through Kensington with the studied normalcy of a vehicle that cost more than my flat and could withstand a rifle round to the door panel. Prince George was in the back seat with his father. Catherine was not present. She'd taken Charlotte and Louis via a separate route to a separate location. The family split across London like a deck of cards dealt face down. Because when someone threatens your children, the first thing you do is make sure they can't all be found in the same place. And I couldn't see George's face from this distance. I could see the top of his head, sandy hair, the slight forward lean of a boy looking at something on his lap, a book maybe, or a phone, or that small blue rock he'd found in the palace gardens last month and carried everywhere since, with the irrational devotion children give to objects that adults would throw away. My earpiece crackled. Alpha 1 at threshold. 60 seconds to arrival. The school materialized. Thomas's Battersea, red brick, and propriety. Other parents were arriving, Land Rovers and Teslas and the occasional defiant Volvo, and the genius of the operation was that none of them knew. They chatted at the gates, adjusted blazers, kissed foreheads, performed the ancient ritual of the school drop-off while, 3 streets away, an armed response unit sat in a van marked Pemberton Electrical Services, and on the rooftop of the apartment block opposite, a Metropolitan Police observer with binoculars and a long-range radio scanned every face in the crowd. The Range Rover stopped. The door opened. George stepped out, blazer, backpack. That particular walk, not quite confident, not quite hesitant, the gait of a boy who knows he's looked at more than other boys and hasn't yet decided how he feels about it. William followed. He straightened George's collar, a gesture so automatic, so parental, so ordinary, that it briefly made me forget there were 3 snipers' worth of tactical response nested within a 400-meter radius. George said something. I couldn't hear it. Too far. And too much ambient noise from the school run's controlled chaos. But I saw William's hand pause on the collar. Stay there. Just his hand frozen on the fabric. And then William crouched. Not the quick crouch of a parent tying a shoe or delivering a brisk instruction. This was slow, deliberate. He came down to George's height and stayed there, and from 30 meters away through an armored windshield, I watched the future King of England hold his son's shoulders and say something that took a long time to say. George nodded. Small nod. The kind that means a child is being brave about something they don't fully understand. William pulled him in, forehead to forehead, eyes closed. 3 seconds. 4. My hand was on the inhaler. I hadn't reached for it. It was just there in my grip, the plastic warming against my palm. 5 seconds. 6. The hug that followed was not a royal gesture. It was not measured or appropriate or conscious of the 37 parents and 60-odd children within visual range. It was a father holding his son with both arms and the full architecture of his body, as though compression alone could keep the world's teeth from closing around this small, blazered, backpacked person. My notebook was open. I hadn't written anything. Some things don't convert to words on a page. They sit in the body instead, in the soft tissue between ribs, in the place where your training lives. And they make your training feel very, very thin. George went through the gates. William watched him go. He stood there for 4 seconds after the boy disappeared. I counted. But it's because counting was the only thing I could do that didn't involve acknowledging the heat behind my eyes. And then he turned back to the Range Rover, and his face was the most composed I had ever seen it, which meant it was the most broken, because composition at that intensity is not calm. It is wreckage, neatly arranged. He got in the car. The door closed. The convoy moved. I sat in the follow car with a child's inhaler in my fist and a notebook full of nothing and a thought I could not outrun no matter how many radio frequencies I logged. That is a man who knows something might happen to his son today and just had to walk away from him anyway. I clicked my pen. I wrote, 0718. Principal departs Thomas's Battersea. No incidents. No incidents. The biggest lie I ever committed to paper. And the hours after a school drop-off under threat conditions have a texture, not a pace. Pace implies movement, direction, the reliable passage of one moment into the next. This was different. This was time turned viscous, each minute arriving swollen with the weight of what it might contain, and then passing with nothing, and the nothing was worse than the something because at least the something would give your training a job to do. I was stationed in the secure monitoring suite at Kensington Palace by 0740, the room they don't show on the guided tours, a windowless rectangle behind the King's Gallery, fitted out with enough screens and communication equipment to coordinate a small war, which, depending on how you define the word, was more or less what we were doing. 8 screens, and 4 showing live feeds from Thomas's Battersea, the main gate, the playground, the East Corridor, the Assembly Hall. 2 showing Kensington's own perimeters. 1 dedicated to the Metropolitan Police's Central Threat Board, a scrolling cascade of data points that looked like a stock exchange for human danger, and 1, in the corner, dark, reserved for what Dame Vivian called contingency visuals, which was her way of saying the camera we turn on when everything has already gone wrong. Danny Whelan was beside me, running comms. His counting had shifted from ceiling tiles to screen refresh rates. He tapped his index finger against the desk every time the Battersea feeds cycled, a metronome of anxiety disguised as diligence. Tap, tap, tap. I found it both maddening and essential. That Danny's finger on the desk was a clock that proved time was still passing, that we were not trapped in some amber-thick pocket of dread where 0741 would simply repeat forever. Lieutenant Asante's voice came through the earpiece, clipped and operational. All units be advised. JTAC has upgraded threat assessment to critical. Repeat, critical. Specific intelligence suggests timeline consistent with school hours. Enhanced posture effective immediately. Critical. I'd been at critical once before. Belfast, 2019. A dissident Republican cell had targeted a police station in East Tyrone, and I'd spent 11 hours in a cordon position behind a wall that smelled of wet concrete and fox urine, waiting for an explosive device that turned out to be a hoax packed in a JD sports bag. The fear from that night had a color, a sort of gray-green, and the shade of something left in water too long, and I'd filed it away in the part of my brain where I keep things I don't revisit. That color came back now, gray-green, seeping in at the edges. I opened my notebook, wrote 0743, JTAC upgrade to critical. Enhanced posture confirmed. The pen moved. The letters were even, controlled, and entirely disconnected from the man producing them, as though my hand had seceded from the rest of my nervous system and was operating on contractual obligation alone. On screen 3, I could see the Battersea playground. Empty. Lessons had started. Somewhere inside that red brick building, George was sitting at a desk, and a teacher was talking about long division or the tutors or whatever 11-year-olds studied on Tuesdays. And the boy had no idea that 3 streets away, a tactical unit was rechecking their weapons, and in this windowless room, a man he knew only as the tall guard who didn't see the Labrador cloud was staring at a screen as though willpower alone could build a wall around a school. My phone buzzed. Personal phone, not operational. A violation of protocol to even have it on, but I'd stopped being a man who followed every rule about 3 years ago. Around the same time, I'd started keeping children's inhalers in my pocket. The screen showed a text from my sister, Karen. Dad's scan results in. Call when you can. I turned the phone face down. Not now. The phone sat on the desk like a grenade with the pin loosely reinserted. Karen's messages always did this. Arrived at the exact intersection of inconvenient and unavoidable. As though she'd developed a sixth sense for locating the moments when I was least equipped to process information about my father's ongoing, methodical, tumor-assisted departure from the category of living people. Not now. I picked up the pen. At 0904, the first anomaly appeared. D.C. Moran, the plainclothes officer positioned near the school's east entrance, reported a vehicle, white panel van, no markings, registration obscured by what appeared to be deliberate mud application, parked on Webb's Road, approximately 140 meters from the school perimeter. The van had arrived at 0847 and had not moved. No one had entered or exited. Moran's voice on the comms was steady, professional, delivering details like a man reading a grocery list. But I'd worked with Moran long enough to recognize the slight tightening in his vowels. The way his A's shortened when his adrenal system was doing things his voice wasn't permitted to acknowledge. "Requesting eyes from above," Moran said. The helicopter asset, an unmarked Augusta that had been holding pattern over Wandsworth, shifted. On screen 6, the aerial feed swung east, and the van resolved from abstraction into specifics. White transit, rear windows blacked, a dent in the offside panel that looked old, a mud-smeared plate that was clearly, unmistakably intentional. Danny's finger stopped tapping. That was the thing that frightened me. Not the van, not the mud, not the registration. Danny's finger stopping. "Run the partials," Asante ordered through the net. "Cross-reference with overnight threat data. Armed response to stand by. Do not, repeat, do not approach until we have intelligence confirmation." The room became a machine. Everyone had a task. Keyboards, radios, the low, controlled murmur of people doing difficult things calmly because they'd practiced doing difficult things calmly until the practice had replaced whatever genuine calm they'd once possessed. I watched the Battersea feeds. 4 screens. Main gate, clear. Playground, empty. East corridor, a teacher walking with a stack of exercise books, oblivious. Assembly hall, chairs being arranged for something. George would be in classroom 4B. Second floor, east wing, 140 meters from a white van with blacked-out windows. I did the mathematics of disaster without deciding to. It's a thing that happens in protection work. The brain runs scenarios the way a computer runs background processes, quietly, constantly, producing outputs you didn't request. Time from van to school gate, 30 seconds at a run. Time from school gate to east wing staircase, another 40. Time from staircase to classroom 4, B, 15. Total exposure window, 85 seconds, give or take. And in those 85 seconds, the armed response unit in the Pemberton Electrical Services van would need to deploy, identify, engage, and neutralize, and if any single part of that chain broke, I stopped the calculation, pulled it apart, binned it, picked up the pen, wrote 0907. White panel van, Webb's Road. Partial reg flagged, awaiting ANPR confirmation. The pen was steady. The man behind it was not. At 0923, the registration came back. The van belonged to a catering company based in Croydon. Legitimate business. Owner had a clean record and a council contract for school lunch provision. The air in the monitoring suite didn't exactly release. It rearranged. Shoulders dropped 2 millimeters. Danny's finger resumed its tapping. Someone, I think it was Collins, exhaled through his nose with a force that suggested he'd been holding his breath for approximately 19 minutes, which, given the timeline, he very possibly had. "Stand down, enhanced readiness on the vehicle," Asante said. "Maintain observation. Resume standard critical posture." Standard critical posture. The oxymoron of our profession. Nothing about critical was standard, and yet we standardized it, because the alternative, admitting that every moment at this threat level was a coin spinning in air, and neither heads nor tails until it landed, would make the job impossible, and the job could not be impossible, because the job was keeping an 11-year-old boy alive. I turned my phone over. Karen's message stared up at me. Dad's scan results in, "Call when you can." I turned it back. The call came at 10:14, not from Karen. From the operations room at Scotland Yard. Dame Vivian took it on the secure line, and I watched her face, which was a face that had received every category of bad news that the protection of a monarchy could generate. Do something I hadn't seen before. Her left hand, the one not holding the phone, found the edge of the desk and gripped it, and the knuckles whitened, and the whitening moved from knuckle to knuckle in sequence like a wave. She hung up, turned to Asante. "They've made an arrest. A man, 34, detained at Battersea Bridge with materials in a rucksack. Preliminary assessment is viable IED components. He was moving toward the school. The room went somewhere beyond silence. Silence is an absence of sound. This was an absence of everything. Thought, breath, the basic neurological hum that keeps a human body ticking between one heartbeat and the next. Moving toward the school. Danny's finger had stopped again. This time it didn't restart. His hand lay flat on the desk like something that had died there. Distance at time of arrest? Asante asked. Her voice had not changed, not one frequency. I respected her for it the way you respect a bridge for not collapsing, with awe, and with the quiet understanding that the engineering was under more stress than the surface revealed. Approximately 300 meters. 300 meters. That's a 5-minute walk, a 3-minute run, an 11-year-old boy in a second-floor classroom doing whatever 11-year-olds do at 10:14 on a Tuesday, maths probably the slow purgatory of fractions, while 300 meters away, a man with a rucksack full of intent was walking in his direction. Past tense, walking, arrested, detained. The threat was neutralized. The coin had landed. But in the space between the landing and the knowing, the hours we'd spent watching screens, counting tiles, gripping desks, something had been spent that wouldn't come back. You don't get the adrenaline refunded. You don't get the calculations unrun. The 85 seconds I'd mapped from van to classroom were still in my head, a permanent architectural addition, a room I hadn't asked for in a house I couldn't leave. I wrote, 1014. The suspect detained Battersea Bridge. Viable IED components. 300 meters from school at arrest. Threat neutralized. Then I wrote nothing for a long time. The decision to extract George from the school was made at 10:31, not because the threat was ongoing. Intelligence suggested the suspect had acted alone, though suggested in intelligence work means we think probably based on what we know, which is not everything, and may not be most things, but because the Prince of Wales requested it. Requested is the word that appeared in the operational log. The actual word William used, relayed through his equerry to Dame Vivienne to Asante to us, was closer to insisted. I delivered with the particular force that a father who has just learned his son was 300 meters from a bomb deploys when speaking to people whose job it is to manage risk with statistical sobriety. I was tasked with the extraction. Me and D.C. Moran, who met me at the school's side entrance on Broomwood Road with a face that looked like it had been ironed flat by the morning's events. All expression pressed out, leaving only the smooth, professional surface beneath. "He's in the library," Moran said. "Head teacher's kept him there since break. Told him it's a special reading period." "Does he know?" "He knows something. Kids always know something. They just don't know the shape of it." We moved through the school. The corridor smelled like floor polish and poster paint, and that universal school smell that hasn't changed since I was a boy in Darlington walking these same linoleum paths with a Transformers lunchbox and no conception of the world's capacity for harm. The walls were lined with children's artwork, self-portraits in crayon, wonky animals, a collaborative mural of London's skyline where the shard leaned at an angle that suggested either artistic license or structural emergency. I focused on the mural, counted the buildings. Not now. Not the Darlington corridor, not the lunchbox. The library was small, warm, carpeted in that particular institutional blue that absorbs sound and hope in equal measure. George was at a table by the window reading. A real book, hardcover, illustrated, something with a dragon on the front. His blazer was off. I'd draped over the chair beside him with the carelessness of a boy who has temporarily forgotten that his clothes cost more than most people's weekly shop. He looked up. "Sergeant Ellis?" He remembered my name. Of course he did. He was 11, not oblivious, and we'd had the cloud conversation, and apparently one failed attempt at identifying a Labrador-shaped cumulus was enough to register in the boy's mental filing system under people who tried. Your Highness, your dad's asked us to bring you home early today. Nothing to worry about. The phrase, "nothing to worry about," is the most transparent lie adults tell children, and children know it, and adults know they know it. And yet we persist with it because the alternative, "There was a man with a bomb walking toward your school this morning," is not a sentence that belongs in a library with a blue carpet and a dragon book. George closed the book. Carefully. He placed a bookmark, a strip of card with a hand-drawn picture of a dog on it, the dog rendered with the optimistic anatomical indifference of a child who loves dogs more than accuracy, between the pages. Is it because of what happened? My chest did something. What's that, sir? Mom was different this morning. She hugged me for too long, and Dad... He paused, looked at the bookmarked dog as though it might offer counsel. Dad was being too normal. He's only that normal when something's wrong. 11 years old, third in line to the throne. And he'd decoded his parents' fear not through what they'd said, but through the quality of their normalcy, the excess of it, the performative ease that only a child who lives inside a family's emotional weather could detect. I crouched, eye level, the way William had at the school gate. Your dad's fine, your mom's fine. We're just going to head back to KP a bit early, and I reckon there might be hot chocolate involved. George considered this with the gravity of a Supreme Court justice evaluating a plea bargain. The good hot chocolate, or the one from the machine? I'll personally guarantee the good stuff. A nod. He picked up his blazer, shrugged it on. The bookmarked dog peeked from the top of the book, ears lopsided, tail a single optimistic line. We walked out of the library, down the corridor, and past the mural where the shard was still mid-collapse, past the poster paint smell and the floor polish, and the 27 years between the boy I was in Darlington and the man I was now, walking a prince through a school that had been 300 meters from the worst Tuesday in modern British history. George reached for my hand. I don't know if he meant to. I don't know if it was conscious. His hand just appeared, small and warm, and found mine the way a plant finds light, not with intention but with need, the biological imperative of a young organism reaching for the nearest solid thing. I took it. This was technically a protocol violation. Physical contact with a principal, even a minor principal. But even the hand of an 11-year-old seeking the simple mammalian comfort of another human's grip was governed by a paragraph in the Royal Protection Handbook that I could cite from memory and was, at that moment, choosing to burn. We walked to the car, his hand in mine, his steps matching mine. The afternoon cold pressing against us like a crowd. Kensington Palace received us at 11:07. The inner courtyard, usually a place of composed activity, household staff, equerry movements, the occasional corgi-related logistics, was operating at a frequency I'd never seen. Every face was calibrated, every movement purposeful. The air itself felt edited, stripped of all casual particles, leaving only the clean, sharp molecules of institutional response. William was waiting inside the entrance hall. Not in the private apartments, in where protocol would place him. Not in the office where decorum would suggest. In the entrance hall, standing at the foot of the staircase, which meant he'd come downstairs to meet his son at the earliest possible point of his son's arrival, which meant the composed, contained, royally appropriate father who'd been briefed about bombs and threat levels and 300-meter distances had made a decision with his body that overruled everything his station required. He was in shirt sleeves, no jacket. The shirt was pale blue, slightly creased at the elbows, the creases of a man who'd been gripping his own arms. His face was the face from the school gate. That terrible composure, that architecture of control built over a foundation that was shaking. But worse now, because he'd had 3 more hours of knowing, and knowing is corrosive. It eats at composure the way water eats at stone. Not fast, not visibly, but absolutely. George let go of my hand. Dad. One word, one syllable. The entirety of a child's universe compressed into 3 letters. William moved, not walked, not stepped. Moved, the way gravity moves, the way tides move, not by choice but by force, by the fundamental physics of a father's body in the proximity of his child's voice, after a morning spent calculating distances and imagining the uncalculable. He reached George in 4 strides, dropped to his knees on the marble floor, actual knees on actual marble, and I heard them connect, the sound of bone meeting stone through wool trousers, and the sound was wrong for a palace, wrong for a prince, too human, too desperate, too real. He pulled George into him. The boy's arms went around his father's neck. The book, the dragon book, still clutched in his right hand, pressed against the back of William's shirt, the corner of the hardcover denting the fabric, and William didn't notice, or didn't care, or was so far past the point of noticing things like book corners that the entire sensory category of mild physical discomfort had been abolished from his nervous system. I stood at the door. Moran stood beside me. Neither of us moved. Neither of us looked away. Neither of us pretended we weren't watching, because pretending would have required the operation of cognitive faculties that had, temporarily, been reassigned to the project of not falling apart. William's shoulders moved, once, twice. The movement of a man crying without sound. The body's mutiny against composure, staged not in the face. The face held. The face was a professional achievement of heldness, but in the shoulders, which have no training, which cannot be briefed, which do not attend courses on emotional regulation, and simply do what the grief beneath them demands. George held on. He held on with the grip of a boy who has figured out the shape of the thing his parents weren't telling him. Maybe not the details, maybe not the man and the rucksack and the 300 meters, but the shape of it. The parental terror that had been leaking through the 2 long hugs and the 2 normal conversations all morning. And his response to figuring it out was not to ask questions or to cry or to be afraid, but to hold his father tighter, as though he understood at some frequency only children and dogs can hear, that in this moment the protector needed protecting. On the dragon book pressed into William's back. William's hand found the back of George's head, cupped it, the way you cup something made of glass. I looked at my notebook. It was still open to the blank page from the monitoring suite. I wrote nothing. There was nothing to write. My entire system of managing the world, the logging, the cataloging, the meticulous conversion of lived experience into ordered text, had encountered something it could not process. A moment so specific and so human and so unbearably private that to reduce it to words on a page would be an act of violence against the thing itself. I closed the notebook. In my pocket, the blue inhaler pressed against my thigh. George's inhaler. The one I'd kept because returning it through proper channels felt wrong, because some things are too small for systems. Because I am a man who stands at doors and watches fathers hold their sons and tells himself he does it for duty when really he does it because he has no son to hold, and no father well enough to hold him. And this watching, this witnessing, this standing at the threshold of someone else's most human moment, is the closest he comes. The door to the entrance hall was still open. I reached for the handle. I didn't close it yet. I closed the door at 11:19. 8 minutes. That's how long they stayed like that. William on his knees, George wrapped around him, the dragon book slowly sliding from the boy's grip until it landed on the marble with a soft, flat sound that echoed through the hall like the last note of something. 8 minutes is not a long time. It's 2 commercial breaks. It's the gap between ordering a coffee and receiving it in a busy cafe. It's nothing. It was the longest 8 minutes of my career. I pulled the door shut with a care that bordered on the surgical, easing the latch into its housing with both hands so the click would be barely audible, as though the sound of a closing door might shatter the thing that was happening on the other side. which was ridiculous, because the doors at Kensington Palace are solid mahogany and weigh approximately the same as my professional composure, which is to say, a great deal more than they appear to. Moran was already moving down the corridor, phone to his ear, re-entering the operational world with the practiced ease of a man who compartmentalizes the way other people breathe. I envied him. But I envied the clean partition he maintained between the personal and the procedural, the ability to witness what we'd just witnessed, and then seamlessly resume discussing perimeter checks and evidence chains and the logistical choreography of a post-threat security posture. I stood in the corridor. The corridor at Kensington Palace, the one that runs from the entrance hall past the private apartments and terminates at the East Service staircase, is not a grand corridor. It lacks the theatrical proportions of Buckingham's staterooms or the ceremonial gravitas of Windsor's St. George's Hall. It is instead a working corridor, cream walls, hardwood floor, like occasional side tables bearing flower arrangements that are replaced every 3 days by a woman named Irene, who has been doing this specific job for 22 years and whose opinion on peonies versus dahlias is, I have learned, something one does not solicit lightly. I stood in this corridor and did not move. Danny found me there 4 minutes later, rounding the corner from the monitoring suite with his tablet and his tapping finger, and his face arranged in the particular configuration of someone who has news and is uncertain whether delivering it will help or harm the recipient. Ellis, debrief in 20. Dame Vivienne wants all principals detail in the Oak Room. Right. You all right? Grand. You're standing in the corridor. I'm aware of my location, Danny. You've been standing in the corridor for... He checked his tablet. Because Danny checked everything against a screen, even the passage of time, as though reality required digital verification. 4 minutes and 11 seconds, which I know because the motion sensor flagged you as stationary, and stationary bodies in corridors get flagged because we live in a building where stationary bodies in corridors are a data point. I'm reflecting. You're dissociating. Those are the same thing, spoken with different accents. He looked at me. Danny had a way of looking that bypassed the usual social mechanisms. He didn't search your face for cues or read your body language for tells. He simply observed the way a camera observes, collecting data without interpreting it. And somehow the absence of interpretation was more penetrating than any analysis could be. You couldn't perform for Danny. That he wasn't watching the performance, he was watching the stage. I counted all the ceiling tiles on the way here, he said. 39. You said it was 37. The light's different this afternoon. 2 tiles I couldn't see this morning are visible now. He paused. Things appear when the angle changes. He walked away. His left boot scuffed slightly on the hardwood, a manufacturing defect he'd identified 6 months ago and refused to have repaired because, he said, the scuff had become part of his spatial calibration, and removing it would require recalculating every route he'd memorized by sound. I took out my notebook. I looked at the blank page. I wrote, "Things appear when the angle changes." Then I went to the debrief. The Oak Room was Dame Vivienne's preferred space for post-incident analysis, and I understood why. It was a room that discouraged emotion. The walls were paneled in dark wood that absorbed light and, by extension, personality. The chairs were upholstered in a fabric that communicated sit down, shut up, and deliver your report without a single word being spoken. A portrait of George III hung above the fireplace. George III, who lost America and his mind in that order. And his painted eyes followed you around the room with the resigned disappointment of a man who understood, better than most, that institutions survive not because they are good, but because they are stubborn. Dame Vivienne stood at the head of the table. She'd changed since the morning. Different blouse, same compressed spring energy. and I realized she'd been wearing the same clothes since the previous evening. The change meant she'd finally gone home, showered, and returned, which meant the arrest at Battersea Bridge had given her permission to attend to her own biological needs, a permission she clearly hadn't granted herself during the 12 hours prior. The suspect has been identified as Marcus Heald, 34, of Croydon. She spoke without notes. Dame Vivian didn't need notes the way cathedrals don't need scaffolding. The structure was internal, permanent, load-bearing. Known to MI5 since 2023. Previously assessed as low risk, which is a phrase I intend to discuss with the security service at considerable length and volume. His rucksack contained ammonium nitrate, electronic components consistent with a remote detonation device, and a mobile phone with encrypted communications we are currently decrypting. She paused. The pause was not for effect. It was for the room to absorb the word ammonium nitrate and everything it carried. Oklahoma City, Manchester Arena, the particular lexicon of mass casualty that every person in this room spoke fluently, but never grew accustomed to. The preliminary assessment, she continued, is that Heald intended to position the device near the eastern wall of Thomas's Battersea during the morning break period. Detonation was planned for 10:45. George's break time, the library, the blue carpet, the dragon book. I gripped my pen. The plastic flexed. The arrest at Battersea Bridge was the result of a tip from an informant within Heald's network. A network that, I should note, we were not previously aware constituted a network. The informant contacted the anti-terrorism hotline at 0951. 23 minutes before Heald reached the bridge. 23 minutes. The margin between a Tuesday and a catastrophe. 23 minutes provided by a single human decision. Someone inside a conspiracy choosing, for reasons we didn't yet know, to make a phone call that redirected the entire morning from one possible history into another. Collins raised a hand. His prosthetic clinked against the table edge. "Ma'am, you said network? We're looking at more than a lone actor?" Dame Vivian's jaw performed a micro-calibration. "The encrypted phone. We've recovered fragments, multiple contacts, coordinated language. This was not the work of a single man with a grievance and a chemistry hobby." The Oak Room absorbed this the way it absorbed everything, darkly, quietly, with the patient gravity of wood and institution. The investigation is being led by SO15 in conjunction with MI5. Our role going forward is protection, not prosecution. But I want every member of this detail to understand the operational reality we are now in. She looked at each of us. This was not an end point. This was an interruption. The network exists. Its members are unidentified, and its target remains what it was this morning. The children. I didn't write it. I didn't need to. Enhanced critical posture remains in effect indefinitely. Additional resources are being allocated. I've spoken to the principal. William, she meant, always. William, always reduced to that bloodless insurance form word, and he has agreed to modified public schedules for the family until further notice. Agreed was doing a lot of work in that sentence. I suspected the actual conversation between Dame Vivian and Prince William had involved rather less agreement and rather more of the controlled fury that characterized a father being told his children's lives would be governed by a threat matrix for the foreseeable future. William was a man who'd spent his entire existence inside security protocols and who understood their necessity the way a fish understands water, completely, fundamentally, and with an increasing desire to breach the surface and breathe something unfiltered. The debrief lasted another 40 minutes. Procedures, schedules, communication trees. The bureaucratic lattice that grows around a crisis like coral around a wreck. Intricate, purposeful, and built from the accumulated efforts of many small organisms, at each performing their individual function without seeing the whole. I wrote all of it down. At 13:47, I was relieved from duty. Standard rotation. Collins took over the KP internal post. his prosthetic leg making its distinctive cadence on the marble as he assumed position, step, click, a rhythm that had become as much a part of the palace's soundscape as the clock in the East Gallery or the peculiar whistle the wind made through the gap in the orangery windows that maintenance had been promising to fix since, I believe, the late Elizabethan era. I should have gone to the guard room, changed out, taken the tube back to my flat in Shepherd's Bush, where a cat named Corporal, named by my sister without my consent, that during a visit where she decided my life lacked emotional infrastructure, would be waiting on the kitchen counter, judging me with the serene contempt that cats reserve for people who serve the monarchy. Instead, I went to the corridor, the one outside the entrance hall. The cream walls and hardwood floor and Irene's flower arrangement. Today it was white roses, 12 of them, arranged with a mathematical precision that suggested Irene had opinions about symmetry. I stood there. The entrance hall door was closed. Behind it, I knew, the marble floor held the memory of what had happened that morning. William's knees hitting stone, George's arms around his neck, the dragon book falling with its soft terminal thud. Marble is metamorphic rock, formed under pressure. And I found myself thinking about this with inappropriate geological focus. That the floor of Kensington Palace had been formed by pressure, and this morning it had received more, and somewhere in its crystalline structure, at a level invisible to everything except the stone itself, the morning was recorded. Marble holds heat. This I knew from standing on it for 7 years. In summer, the entrance hall floor retained the warmth of the day into the evening, and you could feel it through boot soles, a residual warmth, the ghost of temperature. And I wondered, standing in the corridor, whether it held other things. Whether the place where William's knees had landed was fractionally warmer than the stone around it. Whether the spot where the dragon book fell carried some vibration. Whether marble, which outlasts everything soft, it kept a record of the soft things that happened on its surface. This was not a useful line of thinking. I was aware of that. I took out the blue inhaler, held it in my palm. The plastic was body temperature, warmed by my pocket, and it weighed almost nothing. The kind of object that exists on the boundary between thing and idea, more significant for what it represented than what it contained. I should return it, through proper channels. The household administrator, the nanny, the school bag. I put it back in my pocket. My phone was in my other hand. Karen's message from the morning stared at me with the patient insistence of text that knows it will be read eventually. Dad's scan results in. Call when you can. I called. She answered on the second ring. Mark, hi, are you? Tell me. A pause. Karen's pauses were different from operational pauses. They didn't signal tactical calculation or intelligence assessment. They signaled the gathering of emotional resources, the mustering of whatever my sister kept in reserve for moments when facts had to be delivered to a brother who processed facts better than feelings and who was, she had once told me, emotionally waterproof, which is not actually a compliment. It's spread, the liver. They found... Another pause, shorter. They found 3 more spots. Dr. Karim says the treatment options are limited. She used the word palliative. Palliative. A word that sounds like it should mean gentle, soothing, derived from some Latin root involving comfort. And it does mean that, technically, comfort care, symptom management, for the medical profession's vocabulary, for we are no longer fighting this. We are accompanying it. My father, Ted Ellis, 67. Retired postman from Darlington who'd walked the same route for 31 years and whose knees bore the specific cartilage damage of a man who'd carried Royal Mail through weather that the north of England produces with the grim industriousness of a region that views sunshine as a character flaw. A man who'd raised me and Karen in a terraced house where the hot water was unreliable and the love was expressed primarily through the medium of correctly made cups of tea, and the occasional awkward shoulder pat that lasted exactly 1.3 seconds, because Ted Ellis had been raised by a man who'd been raised by a man who'd fought at Tobruk, and physical affection was something that happened to other people's families, or like holidays abroad or second cars. "Mark, are you there?" "I'm here." "Where's here?" "Kensington Palace." "Of course it is." A sound that was either a laugh or its opposite. "Are you going to be okay?" I was standing in a corridor, a child's inhaler in one pocket, a notebook full of nothing in the other. A morning of calculated distances. 300 meters from a school, 140 meters from a van, 23 minutes from a catastrophe. And now a new distance. The unmapped, unmappable space between my father's current state and his absence, which Dr. Karim's word palliative had just confirmed, was not a distance at all, but a direction. "I'll come up this weekend." He'd like that. He won't say it, but he'd like it. "I know." "Bring him something, not flowers." And he says flowers in a sick room are rehearsal for a funeral, which is morbid but also accurate because Dad has never met a truth he couldn't make uncomfortable. I closed my eyes. The corridor was quiet. Through the door, the entrance hall held its marble silence, its metamorphic record of knees and books, and the sound a prince makes when his composure breaks. "Karen, I need to go." "I know. You always need to go. It's your defining characteristic. That and the notebook." "I'll call tonight." "You won't. But you'll call tomorrow and you'll say you meant to call tonight and I'll let you, because we've been doing this dance for 35 years and the choreography is locked in." She hung up. Karen always hung up first. It was her way of controlling the ending, of being the one who chose when a conversation stopped. And I loved her for it. Because I was a man who stood in corridors and couldn't close doors and needed someone in his life who understood that sometimes the kindest thing is to end the sentence for you. I left the palace at 14:23. Through the side gate, past the household cavalry troopers who nodded without speaking, into the November air that had turned from cold to something more personal. A targeted, investigative cold that found the gaps between collar and neck, between glove and cuff, between the professional exterior and the soft, terrified animal underneath. The tube was 3 streets away. I walked. My boots on pavement, the familiar rhythm, left, right, that had carried me through 7 years of service, countless shifts, 3 threat levels, and in one morning that had rearranged the internal architecture of who I was. I thought about William, on his knees, the sound of bone on marble, the way his shoulders had moved, twice, the body's rebellion against control, staged in the one part of him that faced away from his son, as though even in the act of breaking, he was trying to angle the breakage where George couldn't see it. Fathers. Fathers on their knees. My father would not kneel. Not because of pride. Ted Ellis had no use for pride. He considered it an extravagance, like avocados, but because his knees wouldn't allow it. 31 years of Royal Mail had seen to that. If my father wanted to speak to me at eye level, he stood and I sat, which had been the arrangement for most of my childhood, and which had, I only now realized, I'd established the foundational geometry of our relationship. Him upright, me below, the words traveling downward with the gravity of a man who loved absolutely and expressed it with the directional certainty of a letter pushed through a slot. William had come down, had chosen to come down, had dropped from the full height of his station, prince, future king, the vertical embodiment of an institution that values the upright above all things, and gone to the floor, to the level of his son's eyes, and the act of descent was the message. "I will come down for you." I reached the tube station, tapped in. The escalator carried me underground, which seemed appropriate. A man descending into a tunnel, moving from the surface of things to the space beneath. where the trains run on schedules that don't care about threat levels or scan results or the specific temperature of marble under a prince's knees. The platform was crowded. Tuesday afternoon, London in its mid-cycle. Not the morning crush, not the evening exodus, but the strange interstitial population of the mid-afternoon. Students, tourists, the retired, the self-employed, the people who inhabit the hours that the 9-to-5 world overlooks. A busker was playing violin at the far end. Something classical. Something I should have recognized but couldn't, because my musical education had been limited to whatever Ted Ellis played on the kitchen radio, which was primarily Radio 2, and on Sundays the hymns from Songs of Praise hummed tunelessly while he ironed his uniform for the week. The train arrived. I got on, found a seat. The car was half full, and every person in it was living inside a Tuesday that did not include ammonium nitrate or encrypted phones or the sound of a book hitting marble. And the distance between their Tuesday and mine was the distance between the surface and whatever runs underneath it, the subterranean current that carries the real weight. I took out my notebook, opened it to the blank page. The page from the monitoring suite, the one I'd left empty when words failed me. The gap in the record where the morning's most important event went unlogged. I pressed the pen to the paper. I wrote, "He held his son like the world had teeth." Then I closed the notebook. The train moved. London passed in tunnel dark intervals, the stations appearing like breaths, bright, brief, populated, before the dark resumed. I rode it all the way to Shepherd's Bush, where Corporal the cat would be waiting on the kitchen counter, and where Karen would not call tonight because she knew I wouldn't answer, and where the blue inhaler would go back in my pocket tomorrow morning, and the morning after, and every morning until I either returned it or accepted that keeping it was the closest thing I had to holding on. At 22:13 that evening, sitting in my flat with Corporal purring against my leg, in a display of affection that I suspected was primarily motivated by the proximity of his feeding bowl, I received a text from Asante. "Check your secure email. New intelligence. We need to talk tomorrow." I checked. The email was classified, its contents redacted to a level that left only the bones of the information visible, but the bones were enough. The encrypted phone recovered from Marcus Heald's rucksack had yielded 14 contacts. 6 were domestic, 8 were international, routed through servers in 3 countries, using protocols that MI5's technical division described as state-level sophistication inconsistent with an independent cell. State-level. I read the phrase 3 times. Let it do its work. State-level sophistication meant resources, infrastructure, the kind of operational capability that doesn't grow in a man's garage next to his tool bench and his abandoned exercise bike. It meant someone with funding, with reach, with the institutional patience to plan an attack on a child, a specific child, a child whose name would one day appear on the coins in people's pockets, and to equip that attack with technology that individual hatred alone cannot produce. That the network wasn't a network. It was an operation, coordinated, resourced, and, based on the distribution of those 8 international contacts, operating at a scale that made a single man with a rucksack on Battersea Bridge look like the visible edge of something that extended well below the surface. Things appear when the angle changes. I closed the laptop. Corporal shifted, resettled, resumed purring. The flat was quiet. The particular quiet of a one-bedroom in Shepherd's Bush at 2213, composed of distant traffic, a neighbor's television, the ticking of a radiator that has never understood the concept of a thermostat, and the internal sound of a man recalibrating his understanding of the world he operates in. I should sleep. Shift at 0500. Collins would brief me at the guard room. Danny would count tiles. Asante would deliver instructions with her customary precision. The palace would be there, with its marble and its cream walls and its dark oak rooms where portraits of dead kings watched the living navigate dangers that hadn't existed when the paint was wet. I picked up my phone, Opened a new message to Karen. I'll come Friday. Tell Dad I'm bringing the good biscuits. Not the ones from Aldi. The ones from M&S. He's earned M&S. Sent. I set the phone down, picked up the notebook, flipped past the operational logs, past the blank page, past he held his son like the world had teeth, to a new page. I wrote, Tuesday, November. The day I learned that the distance between a father's composure and his collapse is the width of a child's shoulders. Then, below it, smaller, state level. I drew a line between the two entries. Not because they were connected, not yet. But lines, once drawn, have a way of revealing the geometry that was always there, the pattern you couldn't see until someone put a mark on the page and said, "Look closer." I looked at the line. I did not sleep.